Good morning, Anahi.
Good morning.
How are we doing today?
We are doing good. I'm excited for the rain today.
You're excited for the rain today?
Yeah.
Man, that is a statement I don't think I've ever thought in Colorado until this year.
Yeah. We need it.
We very much need
Very
it.
dry.
Yeah, just a little bit. So, what are we chatting about this week?
Today we're going to be talking about spending comfortably in retirement, planning big gifts for the next generation, and the cost of not doing estate planning.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, I think these are quite the sequence, right? We go into retirement, we want to have a comfortable lifestyle there, we maybe start to think about our impact for our family or for others before we go, and then of course there's the question of what if I go sooner than I was ready for?
Yes.
All right, well, let's kick it off here. What do we want to talk about first on the subject of spending comfortably in retirement?
Yeah, so like you said, a lot of people look forward to retirement where it's like finally relaxing, enjoying life. And again, on the other side, there's other people who are thinking about what they're going to give back to their family, if they want to donate or leaving a legacy. So all of these things come in together when you are in retirement. So people think about not running out of money, but don't often think about spending, or they feel like they are going to underspend because they fear that they're losing the money before they pass away or overspend, not realizing how long retirement is. So this is the time where retirees have worked so hard throughout life. So why not enjoy that time?
Sure. I mean, this is a huge area of research. It's a unique and interesting phase of the human life to go from supporting yourself based on your labor, on your effort, right? Whether you have a W-2 job, whether you ran a business, but people have mentally accounted for their cost of living most of their lives through I earn money, and that money I earned is what I can afford to spend. And the transition from that, as well as the behavior of saving, putting money aside, for retirement, for rainy days, emergency funds, all that, it's a weird phase of life for a lot of people to suddenly go like, okay, I have what I have. I maybe have Social Security, maybe I have a pension, but otherwise, generally speaking, I have what I have. And if I use it, I lose it. And if I don't use it, someone else gets it. And walking the fine line between underspending and overspending is, I think, a psychologically challenging activity.
So why do you think some retirees struggle more with spending it while they're still in life and they don't think much about, or they overthink not leaving enough for their family? Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. There's sort of what people say they want to do, and then there's revealed preference. So I'll give you the example. Most people will say kind of two things. They'll say, I want to enjoy my retirement, I want to have a good quality of life, and of course I don't want to run out of money, but also I do want to leave a legacy for my family. Well, if you don't run out of money, you'll leave a legacy for your family. Sure, that makes sense. But then plenty of people overspend in retirement. That's a revealed preference. And other people underspend, right? The number of clients we have that essentially live on their Social Security, even though they have millions of dollars, is quite surprising to me. It's something I'm always sort of bemused by, is how frugally people continue to live in retirement. But when we think about the idea of this revealed preference question, there's a lot of research that suggests, for example, that retirees are happier to spend money they think is inexhaustible. It's like they're more than happy to spend their pension. They're more than happy to spend their Social Security. If they buy annuities for income, they're more than happy to spend that money. But they have a harder time taking distributions and spending money from a pool of assets they can see. Technically, Social Security has a pool of assets. Technically, their pension has a pool of assets. Technically, the insurance company that sold them the annuity has a pool of assets. But they don't. It's sort of this sight unseen phenomenon, and they feel a lot more comfortable with that. So there's honestly an argument out there to be made that a lot of people, if they want to be the happiest in retirement, but they also want to leave a legacy, is that they should actually just convert all of their income into some sort of annuity, or all their assets into some sort of annuity, so that way they can just spend it carefree and never worry about running out of it, other than whatever they have and whether it's enough. And then otherwise they should, if they want to leave a legacy, buy a life insurance policy and, you leave that as their legacy and then not overthink it. Like there's a simplification argument for that. There are still some risks in that approach, interest rate risks, inflation risks, because if you've got a fixed income but it doesn't keep pace with inflation, that can be a big problem. So it's not the most risk-free approach to retirement, but it is a way that you could oversimplify it and just say, like, look, I'm just going to take all the stress and considerations off the table and just go with it.
So if they wait to take all of their distributions and stuff like that, everything just gets transferred over to like their will and their trust and stuff like that for the next coming people?
Well, so a lot of stuff is going to pass by process of law. So, for example, if you have an IRA, a Roth IRA, a 401k, pretty much all retirement accounts are going to require you to fill out a beneficiary designation. And so those assets should go straight to those beneficiaries. Now, there are sometimes reasons that you want to make a trust the beneficiary instead of an individual, particularly if you have young children, particularly if you have maybe a family member that's not very responsible. And if we get into more advanced estate planning questions, there can even be, fully adult responsible people in your family, but still reasons you want to try to leave money not to them directly, whether that's because of divorce, bankruptcy, creditors. Like, there's all sorts of reasons that you might want to keep money out of the individual people's names. But yeah, otherwise, generally speaking, if you die, you're going to leave behind whatever you had. And that's going to go to your family. If we have a will, it'll go through probate, but it should be more reasonably easy. I say should be, but life's full of weird stories and happenings. If we have trusts, then the trust doesn't really care that we've died. It just now, says you're no longer the beneficiary because you passed away. Now there's new beneficiaries. But that's something that you want to consider is, there's certain assets that are better to inherit and certain assets that are worse to inherit. And so it can also become part of the conversation about what assets you use during your lifetime versus what assets you want to leave to your family.
So you mentioned that a lot of people prefer taking their pensions into Social Securities as opposed to taking their distributions. Do you see any patterns at the point where they make that switch over to their distributions of their own personal accounts?
Well, I think there's a couple of cases here, right? I said earlier that we see a lot of people with a lot of money still just live on their Social Security or pensions and not really take out of their accounts. But plenty of people also don't have enough from Social Security or pensions. They need the supplemental income, so they're taking distributions very normally, every month, every quarter, that sort of thing. A couple triggering events often cause people to take distributions, though. You have required minimum distributions at 73 or 75 now for certain individuals. And then, you have lots of other things. I think one of the things that some people don't budget for well are lump sum events. Even people who are taking distributions. The trick here is that we come back to the mental accounting. People are happy to spend what they feel is their income because they've always spent what was their income, right? They paid their taxes, they paid their mortgage, they saved some money for retirement, sure. But otherwise, they were always comfortable spending the income that they had. That's how they lived their whole lives. And some people, even those who are taking distributions, will get comfortable with that as well. But part of it is, when we do, let's say, a financial plan, we say, okay, you need $190,000 a year, and $60,000 of that's going to come from Social Security. So the other $130,000 has to come from your assets. People say, like, sure. That 190 figure is supposed to account for also one-time events like big trips or maybe a repair, an emergency, something like that. But what we often see a lot of people do is they'll just spend the whole 190. They'll get used to that. And then when the one-off thing comes, they'll come back and ask for extra. And we'll give it to them. It's their money. They have to. But that's something that can sort of mess with the distribution rate a little bit, where it's like, hey, we had a specific budgeted level of distribution and you got comfortable spending it, and then because you spent all of it all the time, suddenly we're asking for more, and that kind of creates one-off things. And sometimes it's unavoidable. You have a really big financial expense come up that you weren't planning for, and the distribution's unavoidable. But otherwise, when we're doing this monthly distribution, quarterly distribution process, we like to bake in, one-off big-time expenses or emergencies, if possible, where people still sort of keep having an emergency fund that they're saving into, because there will be emergencies. There will be one-off expenses. So it's much easier to bake into the overall distribution plan than to suddenly show up on a random day and go like, oh gosh, I need $40,000. I hope it's a good time for that. There are some strategies that can hedge that. You could have home equity collateralized mortgages. You could have just a home equity line of credit. You could already have a big cash reserve. But those are some of the things that affects this distribution conversation is, are we budgeting for one-offs, or are we just going to eat those when they happen?
So I feel like that has to do a lot with the quote-unquote living comfortably in retirement, where it's like you don't have to be worried about is the market okay today, or is right now a good time to take money from my accounts, or stuff like that. So what would you say living, quote unquote, again, living comfortably in the retirement looks like?
I think that's an individual question, right? I think everybody. I was about to make a very broad statement. Say everybody's living comfortably. Like, there's definitely some people who are not living comfortably. But I think anybody who is able to retire has settled into a particular quality of life at a certain cost of living, expense rate, so on and so forth, and has ultimately come down to a degree of comfort with how they are living, what they are living on, how they're doing that. And I think the meaningful thing that has to go in hand with that is that people need to be mindful then that sometimes we get a little excited when we retire, and we start doing bucket list stuff. We buy that car we always wanted. We take that huge trip we always wanted to take. We do all this stuff suddenly, and that's fine. But the trick is that can create some lifestyle inflation post-retirement that wasn't otherwise planned for. So I think it's helpful to go ahead and plan for those one-off expenses as part of your retirement. Hey, when you get your golden watch and put in your 2 weeks and all of that, let's go ahead and plan that you're going to spend $50,000, $100,000 the first year and really do that fun stuff. But then let's be cognizant that needs to not be something we just keep doing in perpetuity, because your plan probably wasn't built around spending $50,000, $100,000 more than you were otherwise already spending in your comfortable quality of life.
Well, you mentioned like the checking off the bucket list things and doing all the fun things that you wanted to do with working with clients for some time now. What is the funniest or most interesting thing that you've heard from a client do during retirement?
I have some clients who, gosh, they have gone overseas like 2, 3, 4 times a year since they retired, and this is fairly new for them. I've had a client take like a 2-month motorcycle trip to Alaska, where they're like going up there and like really rode through Canada and riding around and seeing stuff. And then they met their family up there and did some like vacation-y, exploration, tourism stuff. I've seen clients, move over to a different country where they're living there for 6 months, a year at a time. I think those are a lot of really fun things where people start exploring. I think one of the funnier ones, and this is one that I just laugh at, internally, is I know somebody who retired who then promptly just started consulting because they didn't think about what they wanted to do in retirement very much, and then they just immediately started like just going back to work, doing consultation stuff. And the funny thing about it is they made more money as a consultant than they made when they were working. But also, like, they're happy. Like, they were just like, look, it's nice to know that I don't have to, but I like doing this stuff, right? And so, I know one person who's done a lot of like ad hoc projects in their old industry. I know somebody who essentially consulted for like a decade after they quote unquote retired. But part of that is they got to go to cool places. They got to like work in New Orleans. They got to work over in like Saipan and neat places like that. So there's just a lot of cool stuff. I think travel is always the big highlight one. But some people are just really happy spending their time and their days the way they want. I think of one more case here. This husband and wife couple, and he in particular just loves to ride his bike. 100 miles a day sort of person. Loves to do it, and they have gone all over the damn place.
That's so cool.
Got an RV and a van, and they rode up to the Pacific Northwest and went out to Utah. They've just been all over the place. And then sometimes it's we're both going to ride together sort of plan, and sometimes it's hey, I'm going to ride the next 150 miles. I'll meet you there sort of plan.
That's so cool.
They're just having a good time. They're seeing the world. So that's where I come down to it. I don't want to overemphasize travel because there's some people out there who are like, nah, travel. I don't care. I like where I am. That's perfectly fine. But I think it's just the freedom to do what you want to do. One of my very good friends passed away a couple of years ago, but when I very first met him, he showed me his home, which was full of this beautiful art he had made, and this beautiful home that he had custom built, all of this. And my observation after taking this big tour and whatnot, and I barely knew him at the time. We became friends over time after this, but when I first took this tour of his home and saw his art and all this stuff, I kind of quipped to him. I said, it's funny. I talked to so many people about if money wasn't the issue or the object in your life, how would you want to spend your time? What would you want to do? Where would you be? And I think you are the first person I met who's actually really doing that. And so that I think is the core question here. When you ask like, what is living comfortably in retirement? I think the question is if money wasn't the limitation or the problem for you, right? And this is not to say that you like won the lottery and you have $1 billion, but just like you have enough, whatever enough is for you. What do you want to do? Where do you want to be? How do you want to spend your time? And that is, I think, the most telling part of what makes somebody comfortable and happy in retirement.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's literally the reason why. Yeah, like you said, once you retire, it's because you know that you're going to be comfortable. You have what's enough, what you consider enough for you, and a lot of the things that you do in retirement comes with the passions and the values that you had over time. So that also comes with like gift planning and doing something for the next generation. So once someone feels secure in retirement, the next question becomes, what do you want to do for others? Many people help to plan their kids, their grandkids, or things they care for, like paying for college expenses, or maybe helping somebody buy their first home, or just leaving an inheritance for someone. Uh, do you think it's better to give while you are still alive or after you pass? What is the...
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here about better. I think there are tax planning considerations, and there's estate tax considerations that can affect the answer, where there's a practical answer. But I think it is perfectly fine to live anywhere on a spectrum between I want to leave the biggest legacy on earth and the opposite end of the spectrum being fuck them kids.
Yeah.
Like it's fine. Yeah. You get to decide this for yourself. So when you ask like what is it better, I don't have an opinion on that. I think I have a technical opinion on that when you have a certain amount of money or certain types of assets. But if you tell me as my client, hey, like I raised my family, I sent them to college, I did all this stuff, and frankly, like what I have is for me, and if they get something, they're lucky. And I think the clients who say like I have more than I'll ever need and I want to make an impact now while I'm still here, I'm like, awesome, let's do it. Let's do that as tax efficiently and effectively as possible, whether it's for you, whether it's for your family, whether it's for your philanthropy and causes you want to support. I'm 100% about it. But at the end of the day, I view my role as a financial planner as helping you, my client, live your great life. You get to decide what your great life is.
So with that, like with gifting money and stuff like that, or just gifting property or something like that, that's something that has to come early on in their planning, or is that something that they have to know when they just start planning, or can it come later on in life? When is it more important to make those decisions?
It's like all things in planning, earlier is better, if only because that gives us more time, more flexibility, greater probabilities of certain things happening. But for example, let's say you own a really, really nice home, right? A multi-million-dollar home. You bought in Boulder in 2008, right? It's gone from like $700,000 to $5 million. Like, wow, I'm so lucky that I have this beautiful, wonderful home. You might then look at it and say, well, okay, between my retirement, my savings, all this, like there could maybe be an estate tax problem. And for those who aren't aware, right, an estate tax is going to take essentially 40 cents on the dollar off of everything above whatever exemptions exist at the federal level and at the state level. Some states like Colorado have no estate tax. Some states like Washington have a crazy low estate tax. So it really just depends on where you are. That's the most critical factor here. But, assuming you want to, let's say, pass that home to your family members during your lifetime, while still kind of reserving and enjoying it for another couple of years, you could use something like a qualified personal residence trust, which lets you transfer ownership of an asset like that incrementally and allows you to avoid triggering gift tax issues, right? Or at least minimizes or moderates the gift tax issues and in future inheritance tax issues. You could use something like a charitable remainder trust, where you want to support a philanthropic cause, a charity, a church, something like that. But you'd like to enjoy some income or some benefits off of it before you do that. So there's just different vehicles and methods. And the trick is some work really well kind of out of the box. Some you really need to be careful with your timeline. I think one of the trickiest conversations we have, and we're not really focusing on this topic right now, but one of the trickiest conversations we have is people who kind of brush off the potential need for long-term care insurance or planning for long-term care. And then they get to that age where their health starts to, through no fault of their own, starts to go south on them. And they suddenly are like, wait, I'm going to have to pay $100,000, $120,000, $150,000 a year for care. And the government would pay for it if I was broke. Well, gosh, I'll just give all my money away. And it's like, it's a little too late for that. There's certain stuff that needs to happen well in advance. Other things we can kind of do out of the box. I think typically, though, you really, for various statutory reasons and so on, you really want to try to get stuff moved 2 to 5 years, and there's some case-by-case stuff here, but kind of 2 to 5 years before your problem really is going to come around. Again, there's some exceptions, but that's what we have to think about in estate planning terms.
So you said to think about the property trust that you mentioned, and then what was the other trust that you mentioned?
A charitable remainder trust.
Charitable remainder
And I'm just throwing those out there as case study examples. There's
Yeah.
a giant mixed alphabet soup of special trusts out there for all sorts of purposes. So I don't want anybody listening here to be like, I got to get a qualified personal residence trust or charitable remainder trust because Dan said it on the podcast. I'm just throwing out examples. You know, this is absolutely the territory of work with a financial planner, consult with an estate attorney, bring in, you know, the appropriate tax accounting counsel to make sure that this is all done appropriately and correctly, because none of this stuff is simple. And it can be complex and it can be expensive. So it's something where these are all valuable tools, but that doesn't mean that just because they're valuable that they're appropriate.
So what if somebody wants to do like a legacy or something big that's going to go through time? How do you get started with that? How do you...
I think if you're and for everybody listening here, we really are looking at a number like 30 million. If for a married couple, 15 million for an individual. Those are the sorts of numbers where we go from like, hey, you can just leave money to people and it's not a big deal, to like, hey, some proactive planning could save us a ton of money in taxes. Yeah. So those are sort of the hurdles. Those hurdles have moved a lot over the last decade. They've gotten much more generous, which is great. They, however, are sort of a political ball that gets kicked around a lot. So something just keep in mind here is those are the numbers today on the podcast here in April of 2026. The numbers will definitely be different in the future. So, you know, don't just listen to this one day in the future and go like, cool, I'm below 15 million. I'm solid. All that to then come around to the kind of core question you have here is that if you want to leave like really multi-generational stuff, functionally, you're going to want either some sort of trust or some sort of foundation or a combination thereof. Trusts, again, lots of complex mechanisms here, but the idea being, you know, if we structure these correctly, if we work with the appropriate planning, we can have all sorts of terms and conditions. We can have contingencies for keeping money away from children with bad behaviors like addiction. We can have special stuff in place to make sure that if, let's say, I pass away first and then my spouse remarries, that my money or my family's money that I thought was going to go to my children one day doesn't get sucked into my widow's, new spouse's partner, and suddenly it's going to their family even though they weren't involved in it. Considerations of international spouses, right? If you have a non-U.S. citizen spouse and how you account for that. Like, there's all sorts of stuff you can do for that, but functionally, you're going to either want a collection of advanced trust mechanisms put in place. Again, 100%, you have to work with not just any attorney, but an attorney who specializes in that area. And then otherwise, if you have a astronomical amount of money, now we're starting to get into like family foundation territory where we're essentially creating a charity where maybe our family will work for it or be on the board of the charity, but the charity is going to handle a lot of what happens with the money long term. And you hear about this in cases for folks like Bill Gates, where they're like, hey, I'm going to give away 99% of my money. They're not just going to like send out checks the day they die. It's all going to get pulled into a foundation. That foundation is going to probably exist for decades or centuries. And administer the money and grant it out to specific causes and objectives specified by Bill Gates or his family at the time.
So you mentioned some things that people tend to overlook, for example, like the long-term care. What is something else that obviously wouldn't overlook if they're working with somebody, but what is something that someone might overlook when they're like during retirement that they don't pay much attention to?
I think two things, and I sort of touched on one already, and I'll come back to it. The first one's just age gaps. Okay. Plenty of couples are 1 or 2 years apart in age, not a big deal. But we see a lot of couples, particularly, not always, but particularly the statistically common version is a male spouse older than a female spouse. That's just very common in our society. That's not the universal case, right? But when a male spouse is 6, 10, 15 years older than a female spouse, not only is he likely to pass away younger just for actuarial reasons, but also, he's that much older. So then the widow in that particular case might live 15, 20, 25, 30 years longer than their spouse. And estate plans are often just built with a very simplistic, I die, you get my stuff, you die, I get your stuff, we both die, our kids get it sort of structure. And it fails to account for the potential ramifications, right? What if the older spouse needs long-term care, we didn't plan for it and we didn't fund it, and it leaves the surviving spouse destitute, right? Because maybe they have a very slow need for care that doesn't kill them, but they need care for 5, 10, 15 years. That does happen, right? I have a client right now who's been in an assisted living facility for almost a decade at this point. So I mean, there are these cases where you look at it and say age differentials can be a huge factor. And then, the oversimplification of an estate plan to just say, you get mine, I get yours, kids get whatever's left, that's lovely, well and good, but that can often fail to account for the future life of the surviving spouse. That can fail to account for the behavior, qualification, or risk of the children, right? Or the positive or negative impacts of just dumping money in their laps. So I think it's something where it's fine to do that when you're kind of a younger couple. Your kids are under not adults yet. We're well away from passing away, but I think when we get into retirement age, it's healthy to sit down and really ask the question, okay, what if?
Yeah.
Right? And then to work through many iterations of what if and really get more specific about the risks that come with that. Because it can affect you while you're living. It can affect your spouse while they survive you. It can affect your family for generations. You want to be really cognizant of it.
So you mentioned a couple of things that we need to consider once retirement is getting closer or once you are already in retirement. When it comes to emergency funds, I know that right now we kind of talk about emergency funds being 3 months of expenses, worth of expenses. Does that change while you're also in retirement?
Well, and the classic rule is 3 to 6 months, and the factors there are both spouses working? Is there a big separation of income between the spouses, right? Because 6 months of your income versus 6 months of my income can be very different. When we're in retirement, this really starts to become a portfolio optimization question, because some people are going to want to have a lot of cash because they don't want to look at other options. Some people are going to be very comfortable with very minimal cash because they're comfortable with other options. What do I mean by other options? We typically model for and plan for clients to have access to something like a home equity line of credit or a reverse mortgage or home equity collateralized mortgage in retirement. Not everybody's comfortable with that. Some people like being debt-free and they're willing to make suboptimal financial decisions to maintain the psychologically optimal condition of feeling good about it. That means for somebody who is willing to use those tools, right, where they're willing to tap into their home equity or borrow money temporarily during a market decline or something like that, that they don't need a lot of cash because they have this huge untapped equity pool within their home, and that can provide cash for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever is necessary to help them float over any market downturns. For somebody who says like, nope, I don't want those tools. I don't ever want to, have to worry about that. I want to have my own home free and clear and so on. Fine. That's okay. But in those circumstances, we are then often looking at a need for something closer to like a year of cash.
Okay.
There are some people out there, and there's some models for retirement that suggest as much as 5 years in cash. I don't think those are real, and what I mean by that is that you'll read books, or like a good example is there's what are called Geitenklinger guardrails, which have to do with market conditions and certain levels of how much you can spend more or less, and adjustments to income based on returns and losses. But that particular model often recommends like a 5-year emergency reserve, and I'm like, okay, 5 years, like most
That's
it's a lot, and there's a lot of these are all like rule of thumb statements. There's a lot of things that suggest people should save like 10 times their annual income for retirement. So you think about that. Okay, 5 years of expenses. We're talking about what? Half the retirement pool should just be in cash. Like that's, and not literally cash. I'm sure CDs, money markets, high yield savings, but that's wild, right? So I think what's actually happening in practical terms when somebody makes that recommendation is they have maybe a year in cash, and then they have a lot of super conservative, high grade corporate bonds, U.S. Treasuries, those sorts of things. So they might have actually what comes out to like a 60-40 portfolio of equities and then fixed income and cash. But we just sort of throw these terms around like a year in cash. I don't mind a client having a year of cash in their bank through high yield savings, through CDs, through money markets. That's fine. But the idea of telling the client, like, should you have 3 years, 5 years? That's kind of nuts to me.
Okay.
So I think that's where you come back into just portfolio optimization, because cash can be a strong asset, particularly for short-term expenses and as a hedge against downturns. But if you have half your retirement in like literal cash, that is a crazy, crazy amount of drag that's going to be caused across your portfolio. That's going to require you to save and invest way more throughout your life and career to fund enough to make that make sense.
But like that also, it'd be scary having that much just liquid, just cash liquid there. And so do you think a year also helps the safety part of that?
Well, also the safety part of it, because the scenario here is this: you have somebody in retirement, their portfolio is declining, right? We're in a bear market, we're down 10%, we're down 20%. You go like, okay, we got to stop taking distributions for a while because we're selling assets at just too deep of a discount. So we need to just pause this. We're going to start living on the savings. And you say, okay, if it's a 10% downturn, maybe it takes 3, 4, 5 months to come back. If it's a 20% downturn, maybe it takes 6 to 9 months to come back. If it's deeper than that, which is very uncommon, but is likely to happen in the span of somebody's retirement time frame, you're saying, look, let's just live on cash as long as we can. And then when we get to like the last month or two, if it's taking that long to recover, we can have a conversation about whether the market has recovered sufficiently that we're willing to start selling assets again, even if it's still at a slight discount. Or again, we can go to home equity line of credit, reverse mortgage, home equity collateralized mortgage, these other options, and look at borrowing against those assets. Because yeah, that might cost us 5, 6, 7% a year in interest. It's not great, but that's cheaper than selling my stuff at a 20, 30% discount. So that's just something where, again, people's flexibility and willingness is there. If somebody wants to be super duper ultra conservative, sure, they could have even more, right? And this is where you get into like buckets and laddering strategy, where you're buying treasuries, you're buying CDs, and you got like a 1-year CD and a 2-year CD and a 3-year CD and a 4-year CD, and you're like, look, I've got my cash lined up for the next several years, and if I don't need it, I can just keep living on my portfolio. Cool, but then if the worst comes to pass, I've got this stack up. Again, I think the cash drag there is problematic, but I understand the psychology behind it. And again, some people just would rather optimize for personal comfort psychologically and lower stress than optimizing for maximum lifetime returns. And fair enough.
They've mentioned the HELOC and products similar to the HELOC. Or do you see those happening more often in retirement then?
I mean, I'm recommending something like that to every client in retirement.
Yeah.
I see a lot of clients sort of decline to do it, honestly. And it's something where it's like, look, it is psychologically driven. Okay. It's like, hey, we could get a home equity collateralized mortgage and never use it. Right? But we have it in our toolkit. Okay. And people are like, I get that, sure, but like, I think I only want to do that if and when the time comes, and I don't want to pre-do it. That's fine. That's a fair enough decision. I think the greater challenge then is some people are willing to wait way too long for that. So for example, a lot of people will say like, well, I would use my home equity if I was out of all my other money. Okay, I understand that decision, but all the research on the proper use of reverse mortgages or home equity collateralized mortgages is that you want to use them to smooth over volatility or rough patches in your kind of financial portfolio, your lifespan, so that you don't burn through your other assets. And that's the best use for these tools. And yet people often, like the most common use case I see for reverse mortgages is, Mr. and Mrs. Smith are in their late 80s. Mr. Smith needs long-term care. Mrs. Smith's not quite there yet, but we've already burned up all our money on Mr. Smith's long-term care. So now that we've burned all our other money, let's use a reverse mortgage to keep paying for Mr. Smith's long-term care while Mrs. Smith lives in the house. And that works. But I don't love that strategy. It's a very suboptimal approach where we could have probably done better planning and better funding for something like that.
Because it was taken too late? The HELOC was taken too late?
Well, taking too late, but also, again, like the reverse mortgage is also a finite pool of assets. So then the question here is this the most efficient pool of assets? How much money do we pay in extra taxes by ripping money out of our 401ks or IRAs in extra lump sums, right? So, did we accidentally push ourselves into the 22, 24, 32% tax brackets at various points of our retirement when we wouldn't have had to if we would have used something like that home equity collateralized mortgage instead? That's the thing where we've burned money unnecessarily to avoid this decision.
So now on the flip side of everything that we talked about, what if somebody hasn't done any estate planning? So estate planning is pretty much for everybody. Not pretty much, is for everybody. And
everyone will die, believe it or not.
Yes. And it gives everyone control of what to do with their money after they're passing. The biggest mistake after working so hard, I think, is not planning accordingly. And it goes through many different stages. And somehow, at some point, it ends up somewhere, but it takes a long while. So what happens? What happens if somebody passes away and they didn't do any planning?
Yeah, if you do not have any estate plan in place whatsoever, then you are dying what is called intestate, right? Meaning you do not have documents for your last will and testament, you don't have trust, anything like that. And even if you have a will or have a trust, if you have not structured them correctly or titled things correctly or made things correctly to the beneficiaries, you can still end up with parts of your estate that go through probate that are not well covered by your will or by your trust. So let's take the circumstance of somebody who doesn't have a will, doesn't have a trust. They are just hit by the bus suddenly. Okay. Anything that they owned that was jointly titled, depending on the nature of the joint titling, will either transfer fully to the person it's jointly held with. So this is where we get account types like joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Anything that had a beneficiary designation, like let's say an IRA or Roth IRA, is going to become the property of the appropriate beneficiaries. That's going to kind of happen automatically. This is called a transfer by process of law. But then, let's say you did a checking account and you never established a transfer on death or a pay on death designation. That's going to go through probate. You had a car. Most people don't have some sort of beneficiary designation for tangible assets. It's going to go through probate. Let's say your house, maybe you're married or unmarried, but let's say you were the only person on your house. It's going to go through probate. So this is where the nightmare stuff happens.
Okay.
Where it's all solvable, but it takes a lot longer. It's a lot more of a pain. And depending on the state you live in, some states have stricter intestacy laws than others that may result in your assets being divided up amongst your family members in a way you wouldn't have intended. So it's something where you sometimes hear about like, oh, such and such passed away, and now some of their money's going to their parents, and some of their money's going to their siblings, some of the money's going to their kids, but the spouse doesn't get to keep all of it. And those are the sort of scary circumstances that can happen. So that's just the base scenario here is, if you don't have an estate plan, your state has one for you.
Yeah.
You do not know necessarily whether that's what you would want to have happen.
Okay. So from what I've learned in my class and from you mentioned, probate sounds pretty scary. Or it doesn't sound like the best thing ever. What is it? What is it like? What is it?
I mean, functionally, you are going to the court and saying, hi, this person has died. They did not have a will or anything, but I am their spouse, or I am their parent, or I am their sibling, and I am petitioning the court to appoint me as their representative, right? I'm saying, hey, I think I'm the person to do this. Okay. Problem number one, you might not be the only person who has that belief, right? This is where families that don't get along, don't like each other, whatever can happen there. Secondly, the court may appoint you, they may not. Third, then still the intestacy laws may kick in, so the court might say, hey, we're letting you do that, but here's how you're going to have to divide things. In the meantime, we're paying the court for any relevant fees. We may have to pay attorney's fees or kind of court costs as part of this process, because if you didn't plan ahead, you're just shifting the burden onto your survivors, and the estate is going to have to pay for that stuff if the estate has the money to pay for that stuff. We can be running into issues with funerary instructions, right? Do they want to be buried, cremated? What do they want to have happen? So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that that is kind of challenging and problematic, just from the standpoint of looking at it and going, okay, this is what we wanted to have happen, but it's not written here. And so now these third parties are involved in the process. Now, even if you have a will, you're going to end up going through probate, but the nice thing is the will sort of provides the instruction manual. Hi, the will says that this person is supposed to be my representative when I die, and here's what I want to have happen with my stuff. And the court will look at that and say, okay, sure, as long as they don't find any problem with it. And then you can kind of go through it. But the issue there is sometimes, again, the will is not properly written or structured, and some stuff can fall outside of it. And then that stuff goes through the last process I described. With trusts, the trick with trust is as long as all the assets either go into the trust or are already in the trust, then your death is actually sort of a meaningless event. It might trigger the shifting of assets into the trust, but otherwise, just generally speaking, then your trustee or your successor trustee now has power to just administer all these accounts or all these assets or all this property and do what they need to do within the guidance of the trust. And trust is where we get into like really specific instructions, where you might say, I have 2 minor children and I don't want them to get any money other than for their education or welfare until they're, let's say, 18, and then again when they're 25, and then again when they're 30. And, I only want them to get like 25% and then 25% and then 50% because I don't want to ruin their lives by just dumping a pile of money in their lap.
So between trust and wills obviously don't go to probate and have a extensive process like the will sounds like it has, or I guess the will is the instructions, but like going through probate sounds like a long, extensive, costly process. So why do I guess what are like the moving factors that people look between choosing a will or a trust?
This is very state specific. So this is something where I think the natural disclaimer here is don't just listen to this podcast and be like, I like what Dan said, I'll do that. You have to talk to legal counsel. That's going to be the answer here. I think some factors are going to be ease of administration during life versus ease of administration during death. I think there's certain costs in certain ways, depending on how your stuff is set up, where you might have accounting costs or legal costs on an ongoing basis because you used a certain structure of trust versus not doing that. It also depends, right? Like I'll just give 2 state examples. Colorado is sort of a famously easy, quote unquote, probate state, where probate sucks everywhere, but it sucks less in Colorado than other places. Places like California are famously awful probate states where you'd be crazy not to have a trust. So, again, consult with an attorney. It's always an individualized question, but that's just something where, depending on the nature of your instructions, your family, your objectives, you might want one, and then later you might want a different one, or you might have a trust for a little while and then say, I don't think this is going to serve its purpose in the future. We're going to go ahead and do away with this.
Yeah.
So it always depends. It's always circumstantial, but this is an area where failure to plan means you are letting the state make the decisions for you. I think you can, if you are very budget conscious, you can go to a wealth.com or a Vanilla or a Trust and Will and get a basic set of documents done for a couple $100. I always like to say, you get what you pay for. If you're or Hearn's law, right? You'll pay for what you get, and if you're lucky, you'll get what you pay for.
Yeah.
So my default recommendation is always to work within a state attorney, because unless you went to law school, you probably don't know what you're doing. And so I'm always cautious around DIY platforms, but for some people, it's the budget appropriate choice. But otherwise, if you can afford it, I think an estate package through an attorney is going to be a much better decision. You can expect in Colorado that might run as low as $2,000, but I think you have to anticipate it could be more like $4,000 or $5,000. And again, Hearn's law, you will pay for what you get. You'll be lucky if you get what you pay for, but I think you're much more likely to get what you paid for working with a professional than just downloading some stuff online.
Okay, so you mentioned obviously it depends on anyone or on what the thing is. Like if it's somebody who's young in their 30s and have no kids and don't have real big assets to their name, or somebody who is older, already in retirement, have kids, grandkids, when is it really serious to get that lawyer consult?
Everybody should have an estate plan. Okay. Right, like you Anahi, do you have a will or a trust?
I don't.
You should probably get one.
Okay, I'm asking you that. Yeah. That's the reason I'm asking.
I mean, but that's the honest truth, though. And again, does Anahi need to go pay $4,000 to have an attorney make her a very robust estate package? Okay. I'm going to say probably not, but I don't know. I don't know everything about your circumstances. But should you at least have a basic template will that at least just says like, hey, I want everything to go to my sister, or I want some stuff to go to my parents or something. Like you bought your parents a home, right? If you're a co-owner of that property, there's estate questions there. You have bank accounts. Do you have pay on death designations for those, or are they all just going to go into probate when you pass away? You're about to start your 401k here, right? Like you're going to set up a beneficiary designation there. Yeah, you're at your 3 months. Congratulations. But like that's the sort of stuff where it's like, look, a lot of people are like, well, I don't have anything. Yeah. You sure do, right? Unless you're walking around the world naked and hungry, you have something.
There's something.
So it's very important to get this stuff taken care of. And again, it's not a one and done thing.
Yeah.
You get what is sufficient and what you need for the time being. And as your life matures, as your finances mature, as your relationships, your family, et cetera, matures, you need to periodically review it and work with the appropriate professionals when necessary.
So it keeps changing over life, so the sooner the better, and then keep updating as time goes.
Yeah, I mean, there's the will or the trust you want when you're single. There's a will or trust you want when you get married. There's a will or trust that you want when you have kids. There's a will and trust when you have more kids. There's a will and trust you have when your kids get old enough to start handling things on their own, where now they've grown out of the stuff you would have wanted for them when they were 2. There's the will and trust you have when stuff is going to affect your parents or your siblings, or maybe you have a special needs person in your family that you want to provide for. There's the difference in the estate planning when you have a lot of money versus a little money. Like it's always about life changes. And that's the critical question here is, are we accounting for this, or did we get a will done in 1983 and we've never looked at it since? Yeah. That's a problem.
Okay. So the objective is to look at estate and will planning.
Yeah, I mean, just get it done. Do some research on it. Again, please, people, do not just Google will template somewhere, because the laws in every state are different. The rules in every state are different. Random examples: in Colorado, you can't disinherit your spouse. In Louisiana, you can't disinherit any children. There's just special rules in every place where don't wing it, right? At the very least, pay a couple $100, use a software platform that offers a product at the very minimum. But even then, if you've got the money for it, I cannot recommend legal counsel more strongly enough. A lot of people are penny wise and pound foolish on this stuff, and I think it's very much a thing where the second the attorney catches one problem, they just pay it for themselves, hand over fist. So,
noted.
Okay. Well, Anahi, I think there's a question we like to ask every week that you're on the podcast. So what have you learned since last time you were on you'd like to share with our audience?
No funny word today.
No move.
No move. So this previous week, I learned about the step-up on basis and the carry-on basis, which is a tax advantage that occurs when an asset is inherited after someone passes away. So without a step-up, people would owe capital gain tax on assets growth over the years. For example, if somebody or like a parent purchases a property for $400, and when they pass away, it's valued at $600. The basis would be at $600, not when they bought they bought the property. So the day of their death is usually the value. The day of their death is used to value the asset, but valuation can also happen up to 6 months later, as opposed to the carry-on basis, like I mentioned, which happens when something is gifted in life. The basis continues to be the value in which the owner bought it for, usually causing a bigger capital gain or tax liability.
Yep, and I think there's a good practical example of where this happens. Sometimes you have an older parent who starts to jointly title accounts with their like responsible children. Hey, my daughter's helping me out, and I'm going to go ahead and put her name on a bunch of accounts, and I'm going to make her the survivor of the accounts. And that's a problem because that can deprive you of step-ups in basis and create more carryover. Where, for example, like in that joint tenants with rights to survivorship account, if it was individually in my name, it'd get 100% step up. So I bought it for 10, it's worth 100, it goes up to 100, no taxes, great. But if it's jointly titled, then it's going to go from 10 up half the distance there. So $45, right? So now its basis is 55 instead of 100, and now my survivor might owe taxes if they sell those assets because it splits the difference there. So there's again good reasons to gift during a lifetime, but step up in basis is a great reason to keep stuff in your own name if you are anticipating you might pass away soon. Big caveats here being estate tax and estate planning problems. Again, if we're above that 15 million or above that 30 million threshold for an individual or married couple, that's where we look a lot more at lifetime gifting or trust mechanisms to try to move money out of the estate before you pass away. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.